Hi, my name is Don Marsh and welcome to The Proper Pour. Today we'll be talking about whiskey, one of the most misunderstood categories of spirits. Here on The Proper Pour today, we're going to be talking about whiskey. So I'm going to try to make this as easy as possible. I could talk about whiskey for hours. So we're going to break down each category of whiskey, age statements. We're not going to go into the barreling and coming off the still proofs, but more along the ways of helping people out when they're coming out and ordering a whiskey. We're going to start off with Scotch. Well, actually, let's start off with whiskey to begin with. So whiskey has two different spellings, W-H-I-S-K-E-Y and without the E. So generally, American and Irish are with the E. Everybody else is without the E, and there are some exceptions to the rule. We'll go over that later. So think of whiskey as this giant family tree, and that's your base trunk right there, and it branches off. So we'll go into single malt Scotch first. So Scotch has to be made in Scotland, aged at least 3 years, and you have different categories. You have single malts, single grains, blended malts, blended grains, and then blended Scotch. And what a single malt is 100% malted barley, yeast water made from one distillery. They will blend years, okay? If they decide to blend distilleries, it becomes a blended malt. Single grains are corn, rye, wheat, okay, from one distillery, and then they will blend distilleries, and that's a blended grain. Now this blended malt Scotch, the second category, used to be called pure or vatted. They changed it. It kind of confuses everybody because blended malt Scotch sounds a lot like blended Scotch. And what a blended Scotch is when you're taking a single malt, blend the distilleries, a single grain, blend the distilleries, and then blend those two guys together and you get a blended Scotch. So that's that. Next on the list is Japanese whiskey. A lot of people call Japanese whiskey Japanese Scotch. There's no such thing. Now the laws on Japanese whiskey is going to be quick and easy. There are none. They don't like to talk about it, but they do follow the Scottish way of doing things. So these guys actually have Scotch in their whiskey. They not only buy the malt from Scotland, but they also buy the actual juice itself. Now, when these guys blend, they still call it pure malts, but they don't blend their distilleries with just anybody. They're very ancestral. They only blend within the family. So that's how the Japanese work. Okay, same laws, but it's laws perceived by the Scotch. Then you have Taiwanese whiskey, which is generally pretty new. These guys are only age minimum statement for 2 years because it's like Kiwi, tropical area, so they think it ages faster. All right, next category we have is Irish whiskey, also aged a minimum of 3 years. Your different categories here are single malts, which is like Bushmills. They have a 10, a 16, the 21, the 1608, and that is 100% malted barley, yeast water, kind of like Scotch does, but obviously no peat and just different flavor profiles. You have blended ones, like very familiar as like the Jameson, those are all blends. And then you have poaching, which is like our version of moonshine, that's their moonshine. But then you have the oldest style, which is single pot stills. And what this is a mesh of malted and unmalted barley. A long time ago, the Irish were being taxed by the English with malted barley, so they decided, why don't we only malt half our barley? And that's where these come from. All the redbreasts are and all the spots are. And what the spots indicate is the years on the bottle. This one here in particular, the red spot 15, has been gone for 50 years. I just came back in late last year. But the spots indicate the age of the bottle. Some Irish back in the day were actually illiterate and could not read. I'm part Irish, so I understand that. And our next category, we're going to go to American whiskey. American whiskey is going to be very broad, but we'll start off with the one that everybody knows or very familiar with, which is bourbon. Anything in the United States claiming to be a certain category has to be at least 51%, so bourbon's going to be at least 51% corn. Now, the curveball rule to that is corn whiskey. Corn whiskey has to be at least 80%. Now, if you're 80% corn or you're 100% corn, you still have the option of calling yourself a bourbon. So typically bourbons are going to be high 60s to low 70s on the corn side with a rye and barley mash bill. If you get a hold of a bourbon that's kind of spicy, means it has a heavier rye content. You get a bourbon that has a lot of cocoa notes, has a heavier cocoa note, or heavier barley notes or barley content. So when somebody has a single malt Scotch we talked about before, and they tell me it smells or tastes like chocolate, I'm like, it's a Scotch. It's going to taste like chocolate. What else do you taste? What else do you smell? So those are bourbons. Now, so at least 51%. Rye whiskey, great for cocktails and or sipping. Rye has to be at least 51% rye as well. You can go up to 100% if you like to go. I love Michter's. I think they're big, fat, rich. Every one of their malts are like that. So rye whiskeys, it's gonna be very spicy. Rye whiskey is actually the number 2 base spirit in cocktails right now, behind gin, but closely following up. My favorite cocktail in the world, the Sazerac, is made with rye. So we talked about the mash bill of heavy bourbon, barley, and rye, and then you have another bourbon that comes out, and it's called a wheated bourbon. So what the wheated bourbon does is they take the rye out and they add wheat, which gives it a creamy sweetness. Okay, so this is the Pappy 23 year. They were actually the original wheated bourbon. Weller was the first released, but since they are related, Pappy took longer to come out because they're aged longer. And if you talk to your bartenders that actually follow whiskeys and whatnot, trying to get a hold of these bottles or tasting profiles, you'll find that some of the Weller products are just younger versions of what Pappy is. Coming to one of your more eclectic areas, not really eclectic, but single malts that we do here. This one's actually peated. So like Islay, one of your regions in Scotland, they do peated malt. So here out of Seattle, the Westlands, they did a peated single malt. So it's mimicking what Islay does. I don't think it's as peaty. Islay on a scale of 1 to 10 peat or 8 to 10s. This one's like about a 5 or a 6. Our next category of whiskey is bonded whiskey. These guys have to be at least 4 years old, could be older, at least 50%, 100 proof or higher. The difference in a bonded whiskey on all these other guys, these guys are taxed on what goes into the barrel. So as you age your whiskey, the angel share, the whiskey starts to shrink because whiskey's barrel's constantly expanding and you're losing a lot of product. Bonded is only taxed what comes out of the barrel, okay? So this is an Old Fitzgerald is a rare one. This is a 9-year-old. I believe we carry an 11-year-old as well. So you do find ones that are older than 4 and higher than 50%. Last category we're gonna have is American whiskey. So I know we're talking about American whiskey, but when a whiskey doesn't meet the standards of what you're supposed to have to be a bonded, to be a wheated bourbon, to be a corn whiskey, to be a single malt, to be a bourbon, or any other kind, it is classified as an American whiskey, which we have several. So this was a very quick overview of whiskey. One thing I will mention, we didn't mention earlier, talking about the family tree going up with the different branches in different categories. On the side of that tree is this little bush, little nasty bush. That's called Canadian whiskey. They are the bare minimum requirements to be called that, but do not confuse Canadian rye whiskey with Canadian whiskey. Canadian rye whiskey is amazing. I love rye whiskey, but all those other whiskeys, y'all know who they are. I wish they'd make a new law and pass them and they have to be their own category of a different style of spirit. I feel like a true whiskey drinker doesn't touch Canadian whiskey. I want to thank you again for watching The Proper Pour. In future episodes, we will be going through each individual category, just bourbons, just scotches, talk about all the different regions. So we'll see you again. Thank you very much.